Hello, today we're going to be continuing our study of Hannah Arendt. We have a book here, Sisterhood, Natality, and Queerness. This professor, Julianne Honkasalo, I'm not sure if I agree with everything she says, but she does a very good job of outlining the issue for those of you who have no idea what the heck is being talked about. So, Arendt did not theorize gender as a political question. None of her major works deal with women's liberations, women's rights, or the gendered aspect of power. In her public life, she neither participated nor spoke up in favor of any feminist group. In fact, the single published text where Arendt explicitly reflects on women's movement of her time was in Das Frauenproblem in der Gegenwart in 1932. Although Arendt found the book instructive and stimulating, she did not see a woman's political party or a woman's movement as a solution to economic and social oppression. Instead, she proposed that women should unite with movements of other oppressed groups, such as the workers' movement, in their plight for the realization of equal political rights. And that's actually one of the very important points that I make, is the failure of the alliance between the first socialist unions and the first women's groups, because what happened instead was that women became, or the feminists became, scabs, and instead of workers' unions working to fight for family wages, as one person getting enough wages to pay for more than just themselves, what happened was an increasing individualization. So we have another text here by Erica Berman, who talks about this so-called feminization epithet, which is the feminization of labor, management strategies, so far, and education, and how basically certain people are doing better than other people in education today. In particular, we should see the discourse of feminization threatens to reinstall an individual subjectivity behind the collective processes it describes, thus you ushering in a covert psychologization. So, ranging from Adrienne Rich's famous lamentation that the human condition exemplifies the tragedy of a female mind nourished on male ideology. It's really crazy, Adrienne Rich's famous lamentation I talked about in our last video. And comparison to Kristiva's characterization of Arendt as a female genius. So, it's like from all ranges, we can have a female genius or unnourished mind. And Mario Fate's claim, this is the interesting one, I'm not so familiar with this one, is that the human condition offers a thorough critique of heteronormativity, which is completely different. And I think I can anticipate what the argument here is, and this is the argument I made in my paid video on responding to FD Signifier, where I talk about how patriarchy is homoerotic. The homosexual homoeroticness is tied to patriarchy since its very inception. Whereas the modern feminist idea of what the patriarchy is has a very one-dimensional idea of what this top-bottom idea is. When in fact, if you go to, I hang out in gay bars, and you can see that the most patriarchal attitudes are within gay circles. Because what does it mean how can you be a man's man? How can you be the most patriarchal man? You can get fucked in the ass by the most manly man. That's what it means to be a man. That's always what it meant to be a man since ancient Greece, right? You don't want to fuck the inferior creature, which is like the Greek idea of what femininity was. You're supposed to have sex with the highest creatures. So if you want to take a look at that discussion of queerness, you got to take a look at my response to FD Signifier work. And if you can't pay for it, I can send you the video personally if you'd like. Arendt's silence on gender constitutes a riddle that continues to perplex both her most passionate critics as well as her most enthusiastic followers. And this person who's writing about it, she's not coming at it from a philosophy perspective. She's coming at it from a gender studies perspective, and it's going to become very apparent as we continue. The dissertation provides the first monographic length systematic examination of feminist responses to Arendt's silence on gender. Okay? And I fear that this text will try to reappropriate Arendt, what Arendt thinks about these issues. But we'll see. What I like about this text so far that I've read is that it does a very good job of just explaining all the pantheon of the conversation regarding Arendt, feminism, racism, all that stuff. I ask, how and for what purposes have feminist interpreters of Arendt singled out concepts and topics for scrutiny and debate in their efforts to understand from a feminist perspective the absence of a theory of gender in Arendt's oeuvre? Why has precisely Arendt been so widely and passionately read by feminist theorists despite the fact that she did not engage in the field of inquiry at all? This is a kind of question that somebody who comes out of gender studies would ask. Why do you have to engage with Arendt despite the fact that she did not engage with this field of inquiry? Well, that's because Arendt is, as the other professor said, a female genius. Okay? The most important woman thinker in the last 150 years in philosophy, in politics, is Hannah Arendt. And she's explicitly against a lot of modern progressive idioms, and the reason why, and we're going to get into that, the first big issue is that the personal is political. I approach the vast, rich feminist secondary literature on Arendt through reading a strategy by which I parallel, compare, and contrast texts from different historical time periods and geographical contexts. Okay, so let's just go into the first critique. The first critique is going to be about whether she's a proto-feminist or anti-feminist. The masculine Grecophilia of Arendt. The Human Condition is by far the most widely read and frequently cited text for 4 decades of feminist scholarship on Arendt. Published 7 years after the origins of totalitarianism, the work outlines the philosophical groundwork for Arendt's political theory, articulated more concretely in essays, collections between past and future, and Crisis in the Republic. At the beginning of The Human Condition, Arendt tells that her approach consists of a philosophical and historical analysis of the conditions that constitute and shape human existence. Clarifying her position as non-essentialist, very important, right? She comes out of a true... So one of the big issues that we have today is a confusion between postmodern thinkers and the postmodern condition. So in the postmodern condition is basically the idea that we live in a desert of nothingness, the idea that between all the various perspectives of the world, there's only one perspective that shines through. That's neoliberalism. So between all of that, it's very important that she has a non-essentialist position, because a lot of these modern progressivist philosophies are exceptionally essentialist, even though they don't think of themselves as such. They essentialize whiteness, they essentialize victim and perpetrator positions. And we're actually going to be looking at Michael Rothberg's newest book, the guy who wrote Multidimensional Memory, very good book. And we're going to be looking at Michael Rothberg's book in response to Catherine Guynes. Catherine Guynes is another one of the harshest critiques of Arendt, and we're going to be continuing our defense of Arendt when we discuss Catherine Guynes using the work of Rothberg. Regardless, at the beginning of Human Condition, Arendt tells her that her approach is a philosophical and historical analysis of the conditions that constitute and shape human existence. Clarifying her position as non-essentialist, the human condition is not the same as human nature, and the sum total of human activities and capabilities which correspond to the human condition does not constitute anything like human nature. Of course, the topic of the book is human existence, but it's difficult to classify the study as belonging to any specific discipline or even a conventionally understood theoretical position. Of course, it's a specific discipline. It's a discipline of Junger, discipline of Martin Heidegger, discipline of Habermas. The reason why she can't classify the study as belonging to a specific discipline is because, I don't know, because of the modern corruptions of affirmative action, uh, publish or die culture. The text contains, among other things, an extensive critique of modernity, an ethics of forgiveness, an ethics of forgiveness is incredibly important when it comes to, and we're going to be talking about this, her relationship with Martin Heidegger. A historical analysis of the rise of the mathematical models of explaining social phenomena, and this is something that, of course, all social science today is plagued by the destruction of thinking by scientism, right? The difference between academia and intellectual, right? Arendt is not an academic. She doesn't write for mathematical models explaining social phenomena so she can get grant money. She's an intellectual. She does actual analysis. Nearly 80 pages of analysis on the nature of praxis, as well as the genealogy of Western philosophy's hierarchical demarcation between theoretical philosophy and political life. To quote Margaret Canavan in the introduction to the 1988 text, the book's difficulty and its enduring fascination arises from the fact that she is doing a great many things at once. There are more intertwined strands of thought that can be possibly followed at first reading. Even repeated readings are liable to bring surprises. Of course. See, this is a true intersectional perspective. An intersectional perspective doesn't assume complicity, or doesn't assume commensurability. It doesn't assume continuity. And those, when you actually do the theoretical work, it's very difficult. And you can't have a first reading at all. One aspect of that rich, complex, and multifaceted text clearly does not sustain a reflection on gendered aspects of human existence. This is because this gendered aspect of human existence is a social reproduction. It only exists because of social reproduction of affirmative action. Unlike her contemporary Simone de Beauvoir, who had theorized gender and sexuality through existentialist framework almost 10 years before the publication of Human Condition, Arendt shows no interest in analyzing the woman's condition as separate from that of men. She writes, "What we are doing is indeed the central theme of this book. It only deals with the most elementary articulation of the human condition, with those activities that traditionally, as well as according to opinion, are within the range of every human being." In the discussion that follows, I will argue that the context of the Anglophone feminist Arendt interpretations, both Arendt's critics as well as the sympathizers of the human condition, to be the best indication of Arendt's lack of knowledge and interest in feminist theory and political theorizing. So I think that it's absolutely wrong. I think that Arendt knew exactly what she was doing. She reads everything. All right, so this person is accusing Arendt of lack of knowledge. Arendt is widely perceived as carrying out her conceptualization distinctions in a manner that does not acknowledge the inherently gendered hierarchical aspects of demarcation, such as public and private, and the political and social. Yeah, we've heard this argument before from Hall. Yet feminist scholars disagree on the implications that the absence of gender perspective in Arendt thinking was for feminist theorizing. On the one hand, Arendt is perceived as a masculinist and anti-feminist, and on the other hand, she is interpreted as a proto-feminist. In fact, I think she is the proto-feminist. I think she's more feminist than the essentialist politics that we have today. The authentic feminism. Type of feminism that doesn't commodify emotional labor. Type of feminism that stands for the social, that fights for the social. Just like the recent speech of the Italian Prime Minister fighting. What a powerful speech. I've never seen a politician like that in a long time. And then she comes up with this amazing anti-capitalist speech. We are not consumerists. And then they call her a fascist. I construct my argument in part one by comparing and contrasting the opposing ways in which Anglophone feminist theorists from different historical contexts interpret the idea of the public and the private, the social and the body in Arendt's text. Okay, so long story short, Arendt's argument is that when the personal becomes political, the social dies. That's it. And when the social dies, and let's connect that to the racism arguments that we're making before, the Denzel Washington quote is, that you cannot legislate love. Love is not a political matter. Love is a private matter. How do you deal with interpersonal relationships of hatred? By making interpersonal relationships, by working on those interpersonal relationships. You cannot legislate love. That's what Denzel Washington said. Look it up. Okay? Morgan Freeman's also had similar arguments to make. But these kind of male emotional labor are that consider the community as a whole don't matter in our popular imagination, because we are so individualized today. It doesn't matter. The emotional labor of the collective doesn't matter anymore. The emotional labor is all individualized. I'm particularly examining how and for what purposes Anglophone readers have singled out precisely these concepts and not some other concepts of natality and new beginnings for critical scrutiny, discussion, and debate. It's very obvious why. It's because most of the cancerous idioms that have invaded the social with this idea of the personal being political, idioms I've talked about in the past. It's too much emotional labor to educate you. It's not my job. It's not my job to educate you, or other things like you don't owe anybody anything. These kinds of idioms, pop psychology idioms that have invaded the social and have made us all be incredibly apologetic for our relationships with one another, have basically destroyed the social, right? And the reason is because that's how you can destroy the solidarity, right? It's hard to build a social. What do you need? What does the social need? The social needs unpaid emotional labor. That's the problem with the social. You need volunteerism. You need people to do work without getting paid, unfortunately. And that's what social needs. That's what volunteerism needs. Unfortunately, because the capitalist logic has invaded our socialist movements, everybody's looking to get paid. And thus, if everybody's doing a cost-benefit analysis, then guess what? The union, who wants to be part of the union? Why do I have to do any extra work for the union when everybody's looking out for themselves? And so these things are not found in Latin America. These things are not found in other parts of the world. It's because it's the Anglophone theorists that have basically not been aware of the self-fulfilling prophecies that they are pushing into the realm of the social. First, I elaborate the role of Arendt's conception of the political, the public, and the private in the readings of Anglophone feminist scholars who discovered the human condition shortly after Arendt's sudden and unexpected death in 1975. I will argue that scholars working with the historical context of early second-wave feminists theorizing interpret Arendt's conception of politics as gender-blind and as being directly derivative from her dismissal of the private realm of the household and the embodied labor of women. That's not true at all. Secondly, I will examine how feminist theorists working on deciphering Arendt's enigmatic conception of the body in this text and elsewhere complicate and problematize these early readings. I show how the body constitutes an interpretive challenge for feminist Arendt scholars from diverging theoretical backgrounds and historical contexts. That's not true at all. Arendt starts in phenomenology. Her work is based on phenomenology. And if you read anything like Merleau-Ponty, phenomenology is incredibly embodied. It's an embodied discourse. Now, that embodiment is anything that's gender is a matter of metaphysics, right? It's not a matter of phenomenology, supposedly. Gender is a sociocultural addition. So it's not a phenomenological concern necessarily. It's a post-phenomenological concern. It's a metaphysical concern. So that's why I think Arendt doesn't think she needs to talk about that. First, because Arendt does not theorize the gendered aspect of embodiment. And second, the gendered aspect of embodiment is a social construction that comes after the phenomenology, the phenomenology of embodiment, in my opinion. Of course, I have to read more at Merleau-Ponty to understand that. Second, because she is not clear on which side of the public-private divide the body belongs. Interesting. Because she's not clear of which side the public and private divide the body belongs. Well, it's clear that is it clear for feminism which side the public and private divide the body belongs? I think it means that feminism is always arguing for bodily autonomy, but at the same time, they're taxing us at every aspect. So I mean, they're taxing us. So I mean, it's not like as if it's clear. So I guess the idea is here that if I'm paying taxes, if you're paying a tax, right, you're paying taxes to things that don't necessarily benefit you. I might not go to a public school, but I'm still paying taxes for public school. Why? Because that's what it means to be in a society. So where does the body, public-private divide, fit into that question? It doesn't. It doesn't matter for the feminists because they don't really care about the actual conversation, the actual what doesn't apply to them doesn't actually matter, which is funny, right? What doesn't apply to them, what doesn't apply to their own economic interest doesn't really matter. So the question here is, whether, if in everyday life we are commodifying, moralizing the commodification of emotional labor and not having conversations with one another because it's too much emotional labor to educate people, then why should anyone pay for the education of somebody else who, through taxes, right? How does the, don't tread on me argument go here? Finally, I will discuss 3 readings of Arendt's Critique of Modernity and the Rise of the Social. Critique of Modernity and the Rise of the Social. In these elaborations, Arendt's critical attitude towards modernity becomes grounded in theorizing Arendt as an anti-democrat. Pitkin. Interesting. On the one hand, that's not true at all, and as a reluctant modernist and a precursor to radical democratic theorizing on the other. Wonderful. These are all wonderful lines that we're going to continue talking about. Hannah Pitkin's framing is influenced by the early second wave critique of Arendt. Ben Habib and Zarali both move beyond these debates and examine how Arendt can be utilized for theorizing feminist public spaces for articulating radical feminist conception of freedom. I think out of all of these thinkers, modern thinkers, Ben Habib is the only one really worth reading. Ben Habib is the only one that doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? She sees that Arendt can be both useful for whatever feminist arguments she's making, and it's also very important to take Arendt's critique of the public and private necessary divide, right? So my argument against Ben Habib, and Ben Habib has a whole list of reasons, and you can look at my Ritual Traces paper for that list of reasons. In my Ritual Traces series, the first link, the first paper, you can take a look at that. There we can find a list of all the reasons why, all the wonderful reasons, all the wonderful critiques that Ben Habib has against Arendt. But the only defense I have to defend Arendt from Ben Habib is that if we get rid of the nightmare, if we get rid of the dream of democratic politics, of the holy family, of the holy community, if we get rid of that dream, then all we are left is neoliberal nightmare. And that's what we're seeing today. Early second wave interpreters confront the public and private. Now this is one of the cruxes of the paper. So I would recommend a paper called Personal is Not Political. The Personal is Not Political, written by an Asian lady called Personal is Not Political. And again, wonderful. This is Salah Ben Habib. The Personal is Not Political. So Ben Habib is the most complicated thinker because we don't really know. She has those feminist critiques, but she's also defensive or admiring Arendt on the other hand. So she's the only one that doesn't basically strawman Arendt like Adrienne Rich does. Arendt's political theory in the 70s and 80s, she was by no means regarded as an equal by male academics, and her status as a philosopher was disputed, of course. But that's actually part of her oeuvre, is that regardless of the fact that she was obviously not treated equal by male academics, she superseded them, most of them. In fact, I would say that Arendt is probably top 10 philosopher of the last 150 years, right? So it doesn't even matter, right? That's what's really interesting. That's why you have no choice but to take on the work of Arendt. So this is partly because, now we're going to be doing a very good contrast, okay? I've made this point before, that just as Arendt is called a sexist and racist by our contemporary politics, in 50 years ago, she was called an anti-Semite by Jewish intellectuals. Jewish intellectuals attacked and discredited Arendt with ad hominem arguments after the 63 publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem. Again, why? It's because she talks about complicity, something that the power equals privilege logic just cannot comprehend. Arendt's books were for a long time on the banned lists in Israel, and many works were left untranslated. The Eichmann controversy cast a shadow on Arendt's credibility as a serious and rigorous scholar that lasted for many decades. This same kinds of controversies are happening manifold, much bigger today, right? With thousands of other people. Thus, the dispute over Arendt's status as a serious philosopher has been an ongoing issue. Of course, in fact, and it's been settled, and that the settling is that she's much better than most philosophers of that time. Lane commented on the reception of Arendt from a feminist perspective in the following way. The tough male critics of Arendt accuse her of political irrelevancy, a victim of revolutionary nostalgia, living a hopeless, helpless, vicarious life, and grossly overrated. For them, she is too soft, too tender, unable to live up to their rhetoric of political, and unable to distinguish the fact and fantasy. Lane refers to texts by scholars such as Martin Jay, as well as other public literary reviews in the New York Times and the Harper Magazine. George Kateb's description of the challenges of writing an academic book on Arendt during this time is illuminating. It's illuminating. Why? It's illuminating for our present social capitalist dystopia, or Black Mirror dystopia, where social credit dystopia. Her work surely can induce anxiety. Her fame depends on much of the anxiety she aroused as anything else. She always seemed to be saying painful things, or unpleasantly exotic ones. She always seemed to be saying painful things, right? Thinking is hard, okay? Yet, though many of those made anxious had not read her but depend on gossip, there is ample reason to come away from her work feeling unsettled. That's it. That's why thinking is not possible in the university today. Because we feel anxious, we're not able to actually take on the difficult issues. Because we feel triggered, we don't understand that a trigger warning itself is triggering. The doubt over Arendt's intellectual credibility has been a strong element in secondary school scholarship and the public reception of Arendt. As Ben Habib points out, Berlin, for instance, has publicly claimed that he does not greatly respect the lady's ideas. She produces no arguments, no evidence of serious philosophical or historical thought. It's all a stream of metaphysical associations. In fact, it's not metaphysical, it's phenomenological. So this is what these are like the male philosophers, which I'm not a fan of, right? I'm not defending these people either. So Dermot Moran sympathizes with Berlin and claims that Arendt's practice of phenomenology is original and idiosyncratic. She exhibited no particular interest in the phenomenological method and contributed nothing to the theory of phenomenology. It's what happens when you don't understand that the medium is the message. In a large measure, her overall framework is heavily dependent on the philosophies of Heidegger and Jaspers and their concerns for human existence and being in the world. Yeah, like 99% of any modern philosophy today. Okay, you can't escape Heidegger unless you are. Even if you're one of those people that says don't read Heidegger because he's a Nazi, you can't escape Heidegger. Okay, Ben Habib, I believe, incorrectly characterizes Cy Berlin's view of Arendt as gender stereotyping. Ben Habib, on the other hand, points out that Arendt's personal relationship with her former teacher Heidegger has always been an endless sort of source for sexist comments and critique. Now, here's a very interesting point, and I think that this whole issue requires a series of videos by itself. It's Arendt's relationship with Heidegger. Tabloid attention-seeking book on the intimate affair between Arendt and Heidegger. Arendt was once publicly discredited and accused, this time for being a sexually perverted Nazi sympathizer. That's why forgiveness is incredibly important. Due to the scandals and controversies around her, it took several decades of secondary scholarship for Arendt to be acknowledged as a serious and distinguished theorist. That's the problem with academia, right? Oh my goodness. Feminist scholars writing on Arendt during the first height of the second wave of American feminist organizing were particularly interested in questions of socioeconomic oppression and sexual objectification of women, critiques of white male supremacy and patriarchy, as well as critiques of capitalism. And the wrong-headed idea that patriarchy and capitalism are allied, when in fact they are different gods. The patriarchy asks for you to die, and capitalism will never ask for you to die. Capitalism will put you on a life-breathing machine and keep you alive so that it can exploit surplus capital from you. It doesn't want to kill you, right? The political rhetoric often took the form of universal sisterhood, coalition building, solidarity, consciousness raising, as well as the rewriting of history from the perspective of women as an oppressed class. Now, that is a very important notion, whether blackness is a class or whether womanhood is a class. And the danger of seeing it as such is talked about by the work of Adolf Reed. There was never a one history narrative as Adolf Reed talks about. In the historical context, Arendt's works were approached with similar excitement and exceptions, such as the work of Simone de Beauvoir. As a woman, Arendt was a notable exception in her numerous achievements. She was the first woman to do all this stuff, and that's why she has to be taken seriously. Nevertheless, for many, Arendt turned out to be a disappointment rather than a sister in solidarity. Of course, because she's not a sister in solidarity. Because what is a sister in solidarity is somebody who shuts up and agrees to... It's so... Because Arendt never shut up, she's not in solidarity. Because Arendt refused to not talk about complicity. Oh my goodness. Rich, who was one of the first American feminists to write on Arendt, discovered Arendt's works in the midst of her research on historical accounts on women and lesbian workers. In her 76 title, so again, Adrienne Rich is a product of this affirmative action scholarship, right? Looking affirmative action scholarship of historicism. In the essay from 1976 entitled Conditions for Work, The Common World of Women, Rich describes her shock at reading the human condition, the power of male ideology to possess such a female mind, to disconnect it, as it were, from the female body and enclose it to which it encloses. It is nowhere more striking than in Arendt's lofty and crippled book. What a fucking terrible writer. This is the when people in an ivory tower, right? This is ivory tower people. They look down to the masses and they say, why do the masses vote against their interests? These fools. It's the same kind of perspective. But the problem is that Arendt is not just one of the masses. Arendt is someone who has more powerful work than Adrienne Rich could ever even imagine to bring. Adrienne Rich is an amazing poet, but she's not a thinker. She's not a philosopher. She doesn't think. She's an artist. Okay? In Rich's view, Arendt ignored both the history of women writers as well as the women's condition, and assumed that being human is equal to being a male. No, Arendt doesn't ignore a certain history or another history. Arendt doesn't believe in affirmative action. She doesn't go out and look for something that doesn't necessarily need to be there, okay, just because it's an identity issue, okay? What she's doing is something more important than that, okay? Rich had a significant influence on her generation of Arendt's receptions, most notably the writings of Mary O'Brien, another crazy person, all these crazy people, Carol Pateman, Hannah Pitkin, and Wendy Brown. In my analysis, I term these interpretations second wave readings. All of these people are the worst. All of these people are the worst people. All these people are all people that are stuck in a constant traumatic, unable to stop thinking kind of perspective, where everything is where hatred is around every corner kind of people. In order to examine the negative and highly critical reception of Arendt's work, I want to highlight first the specific historical context in which feminist scholars first discovered Arendt's work. By the time of Arendt's death in 1975, the second wave of American feminist activism was undergoing a rapid and explosive growth. And not only a growth, takeover of the psychological institutions, the takeover of the academic institutions, pretty much take over all institutions with affirmative action ideology. The National Organization for Women and Women's Liberation movement had gained wide institutional and political victory through, for instance, Betty Friedan and the American Women's National Strike in the 1970s, the running of African-American Shirley Chisholm as a nominee for the Democratic Party in 1972, the passing of Equal Rights Amendment in Congress, what the right wing would call the expanding the deep state, or the idea of the deep state. The actual idea of the deep state is rise of the administrative state. That's what it is. It's a rise of the administrative state. The administrative agencies, all these government bureaucracy, that's what the right wing calls this excessive, all these right wing terms about how to describe this excessive administrative aspect of a government that does way more, that goes outside of its bounds of what the government is supposed to do. So basically trying to legislate law. And finally, the Supreme Court ruling the Roe versus Wade. Not only did various women's grassroots movements and feminist organizations achieve wide media attention, they also had reached the academic world. No, they've taken over the academic world. And the funny thing about Roe versus Wade today is that after 15 years of arguing it's too much emotional labor to educate you, now that the chickens have come home to roost, the chickens have come home to roast, or to be roasted, or to be roosted, what happens? They ask for more affirmative action. Not only did various women's grassroots movements and feminist activists achieve widespread media attention, they also achieved works by Friedan, Shula Smith-Firepont, Angela Davis, Atkinson, Kate Millett, Adrienne Rich, and others were read and circulated on university campuses. Again, who decides what the syllabus is? The rulers, the people who can control the ideology, the CIA. And you can look at Gabriel Rockhill's work, who talks about how the people that the university tells you to read, right? It's not for no reason, right? If you actually are to do critical engagement with these thinkers, you would see obviously that Friedan, Firestone, Davis, all these people are in big disagreement with each other. But for this whole idea of women's liberation, of a movement that's united, even though these people are very much in disagreement with each other, the only person I really respect here is Angela Davis, maybe Kate Millett, maybe a little bit of Adrienne Rich. I even a little bit respect Friedan, but Angela Davis is obviously the best person here. Regardless, out of all these people, it's not like there's some sort of commensurability between these perspectives. But again, intersectionality assumes commensurability. It essentializes and it universalizes as well. So it universalizes a commensurability that's not there, which is insane. It's actually really crazy. It's why it's a cancer. As a result of the nationwide revolutionary student movements, as well as a feminist consciousness raising activism, San Diego State University, SUNY Buffalo established the first women's studies program in the 70s, and the feminist studies, the first academic journal in women's studies began in 72. The first curriculums aimed at transforming male-centered or gender-biased academic disciplines by integrating feminist scholarships into all fields of inquiry. Equally important was the inclusion of separate courses in such fields as feminist history, feminist politics, and feminist pedagogy. So the reason why all of this is important is because all of these are ways in which actual solidarity were destroyed, right? What was Arendt arguing for? That feminists should go into their respective fields, and join those respective fields, the male, male socialist unions or the male academics, to participate in that world, or at least to make their own world of it. That's what she did, right? She wasn't introduced. She wasn't allowed in the philosophy department. So what did she do? She made a whole philosophy department around herself, right? And now we all have to study Arendt, even though she goes against the massive indoctrination ideologies that we are living in today, right? So that is very important about forcing yourself into a situation. She never forces herself into a situation. She doesn't force herself into the philosophical academy. Eventually, the philosophical academy had to invite her because of her oeuvre. She can't be ignored. Same thing when we're talking about Little Rock, right? If we're talking about Little Rock, the same kind of thing, right? If those communities were to, I mean, it's a more complicated issue, the Little Rock issue, but we can see Arendt's, I'm just trying to characterize Arendt's perspective against the strawmanning that she's racist. The women's liberation movement, as it was called in the 60s and 70s, was the largest social movement in the history of the United States, and probably the world. Its impact had been felt in every home, school, and workplace, and taken over every institution. The personal became political. When the personal became political, when the political became personal, everything became neoliberal, and the social died. How then could the women's liberation movement escape Arendt's attention? During the late 60s and 70s, Arendt was conducting research on authoritarian elements in American governance. She published several critical essays on the Nixon administration, Lying in Politics, Washington Problem Solvers, Where They Went Wrong. Although other texts from this time period, such as Reflections on Violence and Civil Disobedience, for instance, are sympathetic to the radical and worldwide student movement, Arendt remains curiously silent on the ongoing feminist revolutionizing of academia. She's not curiously silent. She's not. She's, in fact, very loud. And she's loud in her theorizing. She's loud in the very the fact that she keeps arguing that the private space and the political space are separate. The personal cannot be political at all times, in every situation. In fact, we need a space of privacy. We need our private space away from the political, right? When we turn everything, when the personal becomes political, everything becomes a matter of capitalism and neoliberal colonialism. Nevertheless, Arendt's work did catch the attention of feminist scholars of her time. I mean, again, people have no choice. If you are any type of social, philosophical scholar, you have to take on the work of Arendt. That's not because she was in the university. That's because, in fact, she was out of university. She wasn't allowed in the university, right? And that's something I disagree with Gabriel Rockhill about with regards to Arendt. In the historical and academic setting of early second wave activism, attempts to contextualize Arendt as a serious scholar emphasized her notably dense commentary on ancient Greek thinkers in particular. Arendt's wide knowledge of Greek and Roman texts was used to legitimize her as a political philosopher, comparable to male philosophers in the West, in the canon of Western thought. Canavan points out a remarkable fact about the human condition, for instance, is that the reader of the book must already in the opening chapters orient herself in a terrain filled with citations, dense footnoting, paraphrases and allusions to Greek and Roman philosophers, political orators, and poets. Yeah, that's what thinking is. I mean, it's hard work. You have to know all this stuff before, right? And whereas, for many such as Keteb, this textual evidence justified conducting research on Arendt. One striking feature of her work is her use of history, particularly Greek and Roman history. She uses it not merely to provide vivid illustrations, but more crucially, as a means of finding the Archimedean point outside the present to which she can appeal against the modern world and its assumptions. Her knowledge of history and the mode of life and scale of priorities preserved in the ancient languages enables her to draw upon a wider range of human experiences than we are commonly aware of. The context in which the conceptual pairs as the public, private, the household, the polis, social, and the political, which are the most significant conceptual pairs analyzed by early second wave readers, appear for the first time in classical and Hellenistic philosophy. Due to the structure of the human condition, many interpreters see Arendt's thinking as proceeding through an Aristotelian logic in which propositions and conceptions are defined and arranged in relation to their negation. I argue that this type of contextualizing that gives rise to interpretation of Arendt as a nostalgic thinker of ancient Greek polis, the public, for example, is interpreted in relation to that which is not, namely the private, the political, which according to Arendt has properties such as the public and the realm of freedom, for instance, is interpreted in relation to that which it does not include, that is, the household and the realm of necessity. I'm not sure if she is trying to paint Arendt as a binary thinker, because she's not. There is a social in there. A section frequently referred to by interpreters such as Rich, O'Brien, Pitkin, and Brown is the second chapter of the Human Condition, explicitly titled The Public and the Private Realm. The public is here characterized, among other things, the polis, the political realm, the realm free of necessity and free of ruling or being ruled, the realm of speech and action as the space in between. In order to understand the key argument of the second chapter of the Human Condition, I will briefly elaborate on Arendt's reading before turning to the feminist interpretation of this text. And I'm going to check if it's correct here. Arendt begins the chapter by demonstrating how in ancient Greek civilizations, political freedom was institutionalized through a patriarchal, participatory system of male heads of households who enjoyed full citizenship. In contrast to the public realm of freedom and equality, the polis, the realm of the household, oikos, was regarded as a private place for necessary life-maintaining activities, shelter, food, resting, reproduction, as a realm where the head of the household ruled according to his own will. The maintenance of these households were performed by the manual labor of non-citizens such as slaves and women. Now, here is something that I think is crucial but is left out. What makes someone not a slave for Arendt? Someone is not a slave if they are willing to put their life on the line to defend their family, right? If you are willing to put their life on the line to defend their family or to defend your community, you're not a slave. A slave is someone who's given up on that. Given up on that ability to put your body in a conflict in the realm of the polis. Okay? The realm of the polis is one where slavery, a slavery mindset, cannot be accepted. Why? Because you are in a democratic republic, not voting for dictatorships, not trying to habitualize dictatorial or trying to normalize such, top-down ways of thinking. So how do you normalize a democratic attitude? How do you make those democratic habits? And that's what we're destroying in our modern society. Their activity, according to Arendt, produced no tangible and lasting end products, but enabled instead the satisfaction of basic bodily needs. Individual households, so that's what slaves were for. Households usually had their own means of production through farming, fishing, or various forms of craftsmanship, for instance, and thus, according to Arendt's historical interpretation, economic trade was part of a private sphere, not a public matter. The public sphere, yeah, that's still kind of the case. The public sphere was reserved for free exchange of opinions, great acts and deeds, as well as various performance, art, and religious ceremonies. See, why does she exclude sacrifice? Why does she exclude the most important thing to participate in the public sphere, which is putting your life on the line, or in the modern version of it, is putting your social capital on the line? If you're not, that's what Spivak calls affirmative sabotage, which we're going to be talking about soon. According to Greek thought, the human capacity for political organization is not only different from, but stands in direct opposition to the natural association whose center is the home, the family. The rise of the city-state meant to be the man received beside his private life a sort of second life, his bios politikos, free political life. Now, that's a very important word. Bios politikos. Biopolitics. Arendt continues that an important aspect of this ancient system was that freedom meant essentially freedom from constraint. Citizens of Athens were regarded as free because they were free from necessity. Slaves and women, on the other hand, were succumbed to a life of the private realm, were deprived of access to a fully human life, which for Arendt consists, among other things, of the possibility of establishing friendships, moving freely in the common world, and to be able to act and express one's opinions freely. Again, what does it mean to act and express one's opinions freely? It means to not participate in a hive mind agreeableness culture. It means to be disagreeable, and it means to be like Socrates in the public realm. Okay, that's what it means to be free, only in the public realm. For the Greeks, a crucial importance in accessing the public realm was the possibility of leaving a story behind that perpetuated the personal and mortal life of an individual. Characterization of a man as a political animal, zoon politikon, and his life as a political life, bios politikos, was, according to Arendt, later mistranslated by Seneca and Aquinas into Latin as animal socialis, the social animal. The consequence of this standardized translation was the loss of an understanding of the importance of the distinction between the public and the private realm, but more importantly, between the political and the social. Arendt's reluctance towards the social is thus already evident at the beginning of the human condition. I think Arendt's not reluctant of the social, she just realizes that everything has its place. The human condition is famous for what Arendt terms, it's because politics is a realm of civil war. And when that civil war, politics, affects every aspect of our lives, the ones who are already winning the civil war are going to win the civil war. The human condition is famous for what Arendt terms here the difference between vita activa, the shared life of speech and action, and vita contemplativa, the contemplative and solitary life in the realm of thought. Notice that she hasn't talked about sacrifice yet, which I think is a central tenet, right? Whereas Arendt in this text devotes herself to the investigation of the active life, vita activa, especially in the indeterminate and unpredictable nature of human action, praxis, in volume 1 of the posthumously published Life of the Mind called Thinking, Arendt engages herself in a historical archaeology of dichotomous distinction between thought and action in Western philosophy. Although acknowledging Arendt's expertise in ancient philosophy, precisely this knowledge of ancient thinkers becomes a highly contested topic in early second-wave feminist responses. Rich, O'Brien, Pitkin, and Brown issue with Arendt's striking silence on the problematic role that gender plays in ancient Greek civilization. It's just innate. It's just ridiculous. I mean, why apply modern sensibilities to this idea of 2,000 years ago? The idea is to go back 2,000 years ago and see what we can learn from that era rather than apply our modern sensibilities to something that applied 2,000 years ago. Come on. So according to Rich, Arendt's ideology is rigid and sterile political ontology, which justifies the exclusion of women from the public sphere of freedom and politics. Does it? She's herself is participating in it. What is this insanity? Arendt herself is participating in the political world. She calls herself a political philosopher, not a philosopher. She's in the realm of civil war. She is the most free thinker out of all of these people. Ontologically tied to the realm of biological necessity, childbirth, and hence the household and privacy, women seem to have, by essence, no access to politics and Arendt's philosophy. That's not true at all. That's not true at all. The reason is, if we are to update Arendt's ideology, if we are to not do what present academia does to anything that it disagrees with, which is strawman, we would see that the feminist interpretation, a true feminist interpretation of Arendt, would see that childbirth is a form of self-sacrifice. And with childbirth comes some sort of political, entering into the political sphere. Even though it's a private thing, because in childbirth, what are you doing? You're sacrificing yourself. Then that becomes the holy family. That's why the family is holy. Because the mother is willing to put her body on the line to bring forth life in this world. That's why the family is holy. And the father is willing to protect that life no matter what. In modern feminist psychology, dying for your loved one is a form of psychological problem, when really it's just any animal would do that. It's not a psychological problem. Shockingly, I mean, lots of animals would. There's like birds that go into burning nests and try to save their spouses. Ontologically tied, the realm of biological necessity. Okay, shockingly, she observes that despite being a woman, Arendt is no friend of the women's movement, and she is certainly no biographical model for feminists. Rich claims that although Arendt does not seem to be aware of it, her conceptual distinctions are heavily engendered in a way that supports a stereotypical misogynist conception of women and their place in society. Nah, Arendt is not a misogynist. You are just someone, Madame Rich, you're just someone who is constantly traumatized. The withholding of women from participation in the vita activa, the common world, and the connection of this with reproductivity is something which Arendt not so much turns her eyes as stare straight through unseeing. This great work is thus kind of a failure for which masculine ideology has no name, precisely because in terms of the ideology, it is successful at the expense of truth it considers irrelevant. To read such a book by a woman of a large spirit and great erudition can be painful because it embodies the tragedy of a female-nourished mind on male ideology. To acknowledge, Adrienne Rich is among the first scholars to interpret Arendt's silence on gender as a masculine form of thinking. Arendt's silence is here equated with ignorance and even arrogance. White silence is violence. That's what the insanity of modern intersectional culture teaches us, enforces us, indoctrinizes us with this constant remembrance of I am brown. I have to remember I'm brown 24/7. Not only are Arendt's conceptual distinctions between private and public heavily gender biased, but in addition, her failure to comment on the political and social injustice faced by women indicates that she in fact supports the patriarchy. What lunacy. It's not like you support or not support the patriarchy. You see that why does the patriarchy exist for so many years? Why does it persist? Okay, that's a great question. It's a question. Why does the patriarchy persist? That's a book by Carol Gilligan and Naomi Snyder. I read it. They don't answer why the patriarchy persists. Well, the answer is complicity, okay? And the inability to talk about complicity, which is why we need someone like Arendt. Rich brings up the baffling question of Arendt's complete silence on women's role in society, despite the fact that Arendt was otherwise so extremely well-read in ancient poetry, history, and philosophy, and despite the fact that Arendt was a woman. It's not despite the fact. She knows exactly what she's doing, okay? A female male supremacist. In The Politics of Reproduction, Mary O'Brien elaborates on Rich's critique and praises Rich's way of writing form, the standpoint of women and women's personal and political experiences. Again, the cancer of standpoint epistemology. If you're interested, you can search market liberalism and standpoint epistemology, and you can search on the epistemological similarities between market liberalism and standpoint theory, aka why feminism is neoliberal colonialism. What this means for O'Brien is that the private is political, and that's what basically modern neoliberal subjectivity is. The private is neo-political, is neoliberal, right? The private is a realm of economics. There is no escape. There is no escape from the realm of economics. Your private realm in your brain is also an aspect of utility, right? Everything is a utility. Issues such as daycare, abortion, rewards of domestic labor, family violence, legal disadvantage of women, all of these legal disadvantages of women. Oh my goodness. All these issues emerge from the lived experience of women's issues. O'Brien's book is an excellent example of an early attempt to utilize the central vocabulary of second wave movement in an academic context and a rigorous interpretation of Arendt's political thought. Methodologically, O'Brien situates herself as a Marxist feminist theorist inspired by the women's movement, but she also self-identifies as a midwife whose practical work experience motivates her political writing. This standpoint is unique to O'Brien and has been unnoticed in secondary scholarship on Arendt, which mainly remembers O'Brien as a thinker who called out Arendt as a female male supremacist. However, upon closer examination of the book, it turns out that O'Brien's methodological and personal position puts her in a self-declared polemic with such liberationists as Sheila Smith Firestone, who believes that childbirth is barbaric, or such female male supremacists as Hannah Arendt, who perceive childbirth as animal. It's not. I mean, it is animalistic. Thus, O'Brien does not hold Arendt to be solely responsible for succumbing to a male bias in her thinking, but regards this more general and deep theoretical trap to which feminist thinkers have also stepped. What O'Brien criticizes from a feminist standpoint are A, arguments that hold women to be biologically closer to nature, to their childbearing function in society, and B, arguments according to which women can be liberated politically only by freeing themselves from the supposedly natural function. So that's a very good kind of argument actually against Arendt. We'll see. O'Brien's alternative in a moment, since it interestingly resembles later psychoanalytic and sexual difference interpretations of Arendt, but I want to first elaborate O'Brien's reading on the human condition. Like Rich, O'Brien interprets Arendt's silence on gender as a form of masculine thinking, but unlike Rich, O'Brien justifies her argument by contextualizing Arendt among male classics in political philosophy, such as Machiavelli and Plato, whom she regards as proponents of the idealist ideology of male supremacy. Wonderful. So at least, unlike Rich, O'Brien is contextualizing Arendt, which is funny because these feminists are always like, context is everything, except when it doesn't agree with me. In a chapter called The Public and the Private Realm, O'Brien interprets the human condition through public and private distinction and explains that the ideology of male supremacy rests on dualism between man and animal, as well as male life and the act of giving life. She continues that Arendt's support for male hegemony in politics has much in common with Plato, and despite the fact that Arendt never explicitly states her indebtedness to him, the core here is a paradox faced by philosophers of the ancient Greek polis. The effect of the creation of a private realm was to exclude women from politics, but polity, as a substitute for family, is hampered by the fact that it cannot do without sexuality and procreation, and hence cannot do without women. So it's interesting here. I'm not sure if it's the effect of the creation of the private realm. No, it's just the oh my goodness. It's just the fact that if you want to participate in the public realm, you have to put your life on the line. And nobody's going to pay attention to you in a Greek city-state if you're not willing to put your life on the line. O'Brien refers to the symposium in which Plato, in order to overcome this paradox, makes a distinction between the pregnancy of the body and the pregnancy of the soul, which leads to two conceptions of immortality: that which is achieved through children, or the historical frame, and that which is achieved through contemplation. Thus, Plato, contends O'Brien, invents an abstract male pregnancy and male birth-giving, both of which have nothing to do with nature, materiality, or sexual difference. Finally, for O'Brien, Arendt's Grecophilia is highlighted in her emphasis on heroic deeds as well as her non-biological conception of beginning. And by heroic deeds is the strawman version of self-sacrifice as an alternative. So this is a real problem here because it's been how long and we haven't talked about sacrifice yet. Female reproductive consciousness transcends the isolation of women in their domestic prisons. Women grasp the reality of universal consciousness, the sisterhood of which we already have primitive but profound adumbrations. Finally, the integration of women on equal terms in the productive process is a necessary but not sufficient condition for liberation. Liberation also depends on the reintegration of men on equal terms into reproductive processes. Very interesting. This doesn't really work when we have a feminism that only cares about orgasm gaps when it comes to their own orgasms, but not other people's orgasms. In the rational human society, people will only be producers in the morning, child carers in the afternoon, and critics in the evening. Only then can men and women abandon a long preoccupation with sleeping together in favor of being awake together. The passage I have quoted above shows that, like Rich, O'Brien interprets Arendt's distinction between public and private as gender biased. But unlike Rich, O'Brien does not think that this is a result of a personal psychological flaw, which is actually indicative of O'Brien's own projections, but sees Arendt as philosophically supporting the normality and even the necessity of male supremacy. This commitment to male supremacy has its roots in Arendt's Platonism, and so what they're calling male supremacy, I just say the importance of self-sacrifice, which goes back against the it's too much emotional labor to educate you culture, and it's it's not my job to teach you culture. It's not my job, right? That kind of all those idioms, those neoliberal idioms, go against, and that's what they call male supremacy. This commitment to male supremacy had its roots in Platonism. Okay, in O'Brien's interpretation, Arendt's silence on gender is primarily a symptom of a deeper masculine Grecophilia and nostalgia for the lost ancient Greek polis. Again, more strawman perspectives. Okay, Arendt is not a nostalgic for the ancient Greek polis. In fact, Arendt doesn't go to Plato. Arendt goes to the pre-Socratics, even before Plato, first of all. So that's one sign that O'Brien doesn't know what she's talking about. Another sign that O'Brien doesn't know what she's talking about is that we're learning from history to learn about the present. Okay? Nothing else. I find it distant but intriguingly parallel between O'Brien's historical critique of the ideology of male supremacy and later psychoanalytically as well as sexual difference-oriented readings of Arendt, mainly of those of Adrienne Caballero and Julia Kristeva. O'Brien and Caballero locate an emphasis on masculine, ancient Greek fear of mortality, as well as a violent erasure of the ethical value of biological birth in ancient mythology. Interesting. That's opposite of what I'm arguing. Emphasis on masculine, ancient Greek fear of mortality, However, O'Brien does not once discuss or even mention Arendt's concept of natality in her book. Cavallaro takes this concept as the guiding point for her Arendt's interpretation. Equally important is opposing conclusion to which these two scholars came. For O'Brien, Arendt is a female male supremacist, whereas Cavallaro interprets Arendt's notion of natality as a feminine concept. See, who's doing the binary here? It's for Cavallaro, Arendt is the first and foremost female philosopher for a birth of new beginnings. I will return to Cavallaro in part 2. For now, I simply want to, and we're going to come back in part 2 as well. For now, I simply want to talk about the absence of natality in texts that deal with Arendt's assumed masculinity and anti-feminism, as well as the feminization that this concept will undergo later on. So, posturing boys. In 81, an article entitled Justice on Relating Private and Public, Pitkin acknowledges how challenging it is to define the meaning of the terms private and public in Arendt. Coming from Wittgenstein background, Pitkin aims to decipher Arendt's terminology through linguistic rather than historical, philosophical analysis. According to Pitkin, then, Arendt seems to understand the term public and private as substantives rather than adjectives, and this is why she ends up hypothesizing them to ontologically separate categories. This contends, or that they should be separate categories. And if they're not, then we're open to tyranny. We're open to the destruction of the personal by the political. This contends the destruction of the social world as well, if there is to be a social. This contends Pitkin generates Arendt's problematic understanding of the term as non-relational entities, whereas if they had been understood as adjectives, they would have merely described a particular noun, such as realm or a space or a sphere. Like Rich and O'Brien, Pitkin takes the public and private realm chapter of the human condition to represent Arendt's normative view of how politics should be institutionalized, and is deeply disturbed by Arendt's alleged doom of women to the realm of the household. It's not. Arendt is not dooming women to the realm of the household. Okay? Arendt is herself participating in the realm of politics. Why don't people understand that? The by now famous... Again, Arendt was excluded from the realm of politics, from the realm of philosophy. Through her intellectual might, created an institution around herself. A political institution around herself. A philosophical institution around herself. Academic institution around herself. Why? Out of sheer amazingness. And look at all these people who are just 1% of Arendt's knowledge, of Arendt's oeuvre, of Arendt's academic might, and they throw out the baby with the bathwater like this. Arendt citizens begin to resemble posturing little boys clamoring for attention and wanting to be reassured that they are brave, valuable, and real. Though Arendt was female, there is a lot of machismo in her vision. Unable to face their mortality and physical vulnerability, the men describe strive endlessly to be superhuman, and realizing that they cannot achieve this goal require endless reassurance from others and anxious delusion. What kind of insanity is this? As can be seen from this passage I quoted above, Pitkin, like Rich and O'Brien, frames Arendt through the themes of masculinity and nostalgia for the ancient Greek civilization. The narration of Arendt as a masculine Grecophile is also reiterated in Wendy Brown's Manhood and Politics, which devotes the first section of the books to the notion of politics in Aristotle and Arendt. Once again, the concepts of masculinity and immortality are circulated. We're going to be looking at Wendy Brown. And also there's definitely a lot of examinations of Arendt from Wendy Brown. It's found in the other book called Feminist Interpretations of Hannah Arendt. Arendt's rendering of ancient Greek is the model and inspiration guiding her resuscitated political life in the modern age, a vision that involves reviving pieces of masculine Athenian politics. No, it's not reviving anything. It's already in there. It's all these assumptions are within Christianity as well. All these assumptions of public space continue into the polis, and that's what she's tracking. These people are not well read. These are, again, all of these people, they've gotten into their positions because of affirmative action politics, unlike Arendt. Arendt did the hard work. She doesn't need affirmative action, right? Arendt doesn't need affirmative action. Arendt is a true revolutionary because she is the mark of affirmative sabotage. Affirmative sabotage is how I can know whether you are worthy to speak up in the public space. citing a passage from the Public and Private Realm, chapter of the Human Condition, in which Arendt describes Plato and Aristotle's conception of political freedom as freedom from biological necessity of life. Brown claims that Arendt depicts human beings as inherently frustrated with the biological fact of their mortality and determined to overcome this fact in some way. Resembling O'Brien's critique of Plato and Arendt, Brown argues Arendt, following the Greeks, holds the public sphere to be the space for achieving immortality through heroic deeds and collected remembrance. Brown's text is illuminating for exploring the historical and textual tensions within feminist readings of Arendt. I want to point out an example of how different strategies of reading Human Condition generate different conceptions of Arendt in relation to feminist political theorizing. Namely, upon closer examination of the original quote by Brown, it becomes evident that Brown does not deal with the context of the passage, which is a larger argument about the Greek and Roman concepts of courage. The context is important in light of other contrasting feminist interpretations of the human condition, because Arendt's critical argument here is that their attempt to transgress the biological necessities of life, Plato and Aristotle made the conclusion that for a truly good life to be possible, even the political life had to be transgressed, since even this political form of life was subject to necessity. Hence, both the private and the public realm had to be left by the philosopher who aimed to engage in the self-immortalizing and divine act of contemplation. Now, there is another example of context is everything, people not talking about context. Brown, on the other hand, interprets Arendt as speaking about human nature in general. Wherein the light of other feminist interpretations such as Cavallero and Kristeva, Arendt can be read as giving an account of how and why Plato and Aristotle came to think of the good life in terms of a life ultimately independent from the realm of human affairs, be that of the activities of household or in the realm of politics. As Margaret Canavan elaborates in her 1988 preface to The Human Condition, Arendt's lengthy section serves the purpose of a broader argument that unfolds throughout the entire human condition, namely that there is a distinctive historical moments where we can see how the hierarchical demarcation between the active life and the contemplation of life, vita activa and vita contemplativa, complexita, is carried out in the tradition of Western philosophy. I argue that here, it's not so important to follow along with the, exact Arendtian terms. It's more of the general philosophy that's important here, okay? At least for me. I argue here that the particular historical time period and second wave context of Brown's reading is evident. Brown's overall book project is overcoming masculinist politics clearly guides her reading. Brown, like O'Brien, holds Arendt accountable for a masculinist political theory that has nothing to do with life and reproduction. That's the issue here, right? The issue is that Wendy Brown, has a completely different project here. She has a project of, she has a completely different project, but she's using Arendt as an allegory. Allegory is the weakest form of argument. As in the case of O'Brien's reading, I want to stress the significance of this accusation, not so much because of the Arendt orthodoxy, but because of the theme of life, bios, vita, is absolutely central to other feminist theorists dealing with Arendt's political work, most notably the writings of Kristeva. For now, I simply want to draw attention to the fact that the examination of Arendt's notion of life and her notion of natality is absent from the masculine Greco-phile interpretations. This is where these readings differ dramatically from the readings of Arendt as a female writer and a feminine genius. Wonderful. This is a great argument, right? So long story short, right? Yes, the people who are calling her masculinist look at one section of it, okay? And then they expand that section because they're traumatized and they can't deal with their trauma. But we can see that there is no masculine or Greco-phile interpretations when you look at the whole book, okay? Arendt you can find critiques of ancient Greek within Arendt as well. I'm sure if you look hard enough, you can find critiques there as well. Arendt is not a person just, looking essentialist. She's not essentializing the Greeks as being the best civilization, right? As she's well aware of Enlightenment critiques of the Enlightenment. Come on. Hence, the reason why we're in a situation like this, where I have to respond to so many bad arguments, is because we've created a culture of affirmative action culture, combined with the publisher die culture. So, a publisher die culture, we have many, 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 many papers that talk about nothing. that just repeat the same idioms over and over again. Oh, every paper you read now has land acknowledgement on top. It says, I'm going to be against racism and sexism and all the things. Every paper is like that now. Hence, depending on which concepts and conceptual pairs are extracted for critical scrutiny, and which chapter of the human condition is taken as an entrance to Arendt's political philosophy, two opposing conceptions of Arendt's silence on gender emerges: the masculine Grecophile and the female genius. Now, what's interesting here, again, is that the people who are saying that context is everything don't take into account context. So this writer recognizes basically the straw man arguments that are being made too. As I've argued, Rich, O'Brien, Pitkin, Brown focus on the second chapter of the human condition and call her a masculine thinker because of that. The readings are characterized by a repetitive, decontextualized citing of Arendt. Repetitive and decontextualized citing of Arendt. That's pretty much the whole freaking feminist movement. And while they say that context is everything. Brown summarizes her book chapter on Arendt by diagnosing Arendt as an anxious, obsessive, panic-ridden theorist with the conclusion that there is something perilously close to pathology in Arendt's attempt to avoid touching and contamination to situate free a space in which that touches absolutely nothing. Fear of contamination is also used by O'Brien, characterizing Arendt's conception of freedom. Freedom, is possible only if a man can isolate his political activities in the public realm uncontaminated by life processes. In other words, in the framework of early second-wave critics, Arendt's distinctions between the private and the public, as well as between necessity and freedom, appear so rigid that the realm where action takes place is sterilized of any contaminations that the biological properties of the female might reproduce or might produce. Let me return for a moment to the notion of Arendt as a masculine Grecophile. What I find particularly interesting in these conversations with Arendt that I have discussed above are passages in which this discussion changes from a sharp theoretical reflection of public and private distinction to ad hominem arguments about Arendt's assumed gender expression. Thank you. The same people, the same ad hominems that the Jewish rabbis or the authoritarian Jewish community would throw at Spinoza. Same kind of thing they throw at Arendt. Now, who are these people? Who are these people? Are they allies of anybody? They're ad hominem arguments, either in physical appearance, in her writing, or both. Either in physical appearance. These shifts in the feminist author's narrative's tone can be partially explained by the historical setting of the context. So she tries to give them. This is trying to give them leeway because of the power equals privilege logic. She has to give some leeway. To be more precise, why can't Arendt be given leeway as somebody like Valerie? What's her name? Valerie Solanas. Solanas, the person who killed Andy Warhol, right? She got so much, attention. The whole feminist movement came to defend her because she was, in a situation where. So here's the thing. If you are Valerie Solanas and you kill, and you try to kill Warhawk, Andy Warhol, and you try to kill Andy Warhol, the feminist movement will defend you and say that you were so stressed out about everything that it's okay to go kill somebody. The feminist movement will defend women. A lot of feminist movement will defend women from the accusation that of their complicity when the barbarous Nazis come into France, and the French women who basically decided to be complicit with the Nazis, giving them blowjobs or whatever sexual favors they need. Women will defend the Nazi feminists. Women will defend Valerie Solanas. And I love Valerie Solanas, by the way. I would even defend Valerie Solanas. I'm going to say that feminists would defend Valerie Solanas for killing Warhol. They would defend the Nazi women from sleeping with. Just search it. Search the first link. Search about Nazi women, and the first links are all going to be sympathetic links on Google about how these Nazi women, the Nazi French, women, the Vichy women, basically, were ridiculed. And they were like, put tattoos and stuff on them to make sure that people know that this is a person that was complicit. Okay? So, the feminists will defend those kinds of women, the Nazi women. The feminists will defend Valerie Solanas. But they won't defend a woman who does the hard intellectual labor, the most intellectual labor that any, out of the top 100 humans, the most amount of intellectual labor that anybody's done, right? They won't defend the intellectual labor of somebody who's doing the hard work. It's insanity. To be more precise, they can be seen as guided by the standpoint, sisterhood, and consciousness-raising strategies of early Anglophone second-wave feminist political organizing. And I love how this person realizes that this cancer of society only exists within the Anglophone community. In Asia, I can go play with a random kid in the park, just, have fun with them, and everyone's is fine. People aren't scared of, everybody's an uncle. We were all family. Shoo, shoo. Right? There's some attempt to do such a political consciousness or social raising, socially, building a social society, at least, or some sort of interactions with other people. It's only in the Anglophone world where, a guy sitting at the park, and I've made videos about this, a guy sitting at the park is, watching his own kids, he gets called on, right? It's because we live in a culture of vicarious traumatization. Supported by a state that supports affirmative action, social reproduction. Another way of understanding the ad hominem arguments is by paying attention to the specific uses of masculinity in these texts. Texts written on Arendt in the 70s and 80s take momentum from certain unquestioned presumptions about gender. Early critical feminist interpretations confront Arendt's assumed masculinity through the fact that manhood and masculinity are understood in these texts as representing hegemonic, patriarchal, and chauvinist norms and ideals. Hence, the texts that I have discussed reveal not only a political landscape of this political context, they also illuminate how notions of manhood and masculinity have changed over time. Since in their particular context of Hannah Arendt as a masculine anti-feminist Francophile, her assumed female masculinity is under scrutiny, let me elaborate on this point briefly before moving on. The American women movements of the 60s and 70s often assumed feminism to be incompatible with men and masculinity. Masculinity was largely regarded as equal to the various institutional practices of patriarchy, most importantly dominance over women. According to, for instance, the history of masculine norms, an American outdated and normative dominant traditional masculine ideology can be characterized roughly in the way this ideology is dictated by four main rules. Men should not be feminine. Let's write these down. Men must be respected and admired. Men who sacrifice must be expected. So I'm going to update these rules. Men should not be feminine, meaning men should be expected to sacrifice. Men should be respected and admired. Men should be respected and admired for their sacrifices for their society. Men should never show fear. That's not true at all. Men should be brave in their sacrifice. And finally, men should seek out risk and adventure. That's just an innate thing. It's not men should do this. Men just do this. I mean, look at just children. Okay. Again, more feminist insanity. Similarly, traditional gender roles socialization leads men to struggle with four main traditional aspects of society. Traditional gender role socialization. No. These are what the socialization, the gender role socialization that women impose on men, and men get blamed for it. Men should be successful. Do men teach each other this? Or do women show men that this is the case? Men don't teach each other anything, okay? Men don't even agree with each other on anything. Men are disagreeable. You tell a man something, he's going to disagree with you. He's more likely to be disagreeable. Okay? Men should be successful is an imposition not on traditional gender role socialization, but modern feminist society that commodifies emotional labor. This has been even more the case. Today, in the last 10, 15 years, racism, classism, sexism has increased because of the commodification of emotional labor. Women date me because they think I'm white. Women date me because they think I'm white. Why? Because men should be successful. Whiteness is successful. Achieve power and status. Again, This is not a traditional masculine thing. This is a continuation of feminist society when they try to make everything into a commodity. That's what happens. And readily compete against others. Men have no choice but to compete against others because that's what it means to be loved. Men can only be loved because, and men should restrict their emotions. Again, we talked about this in my bell hooks video. Men should restrict their emotions. That is because there is a deep anxiety when, have you ever seen a grown man cry, right? That's the first thing. When a woman sees a grown man cry, there's a deep fear inside of her that's evoked. Doesn't matter, man or woman. When you see a grown man cry, there's a deep fear inside of you, right? Something bad's happened, okay? I've seen a grown man cry in the street before. It's a sight, right? And the other thing about men should restrict their emotions is that it's just not true. I mean, look at from Shakespeare to all the way to, thousands of examples of art, music, poetry. But still, there's this idea that men should restrict their emotions. It's just not true. It's just not true from the beginning on. It's just feminist indoctrination. Men should restrict their affectionate behavior with other men. Now, that's an interesting one because it's just not true at all. Again, right? Feminists have destroyed locker room talk, right? Men should restrict their affectionate behavior. You know what affectionate behavior with other men is? When you're in the locker room and you wrap the towel and you slap them. That's affectionate behavior with other men. What happens in the locker rooms today? Men should be work career driven. Men have no choice but to be worker driven, career driven. And that's not because of traditional masculinity. That is because modern feminism has turned all human social interactions into cost benefit analysis of emotional labor and privilege, thereby giving the men who have the most amount of privilege the power in society, unfortunately, and they are unwitting colonizers here. In their study, The Heroism of Women and Men, Becker and Eagly associate precisely in these types of masculine ideals with the conception of heroism. I argue this type of masculine ideology that all these people oppose, which they also attribute to Arendt due to her emphasis on heroic deeds. In the absence of academic masculinity studies and queer studies on masculinity, this notion of masculinity was their main paradigm for understanding women and in relation to manhood and masculinity. Interesting. I argue that the Anglophone early second wave sisterhood interpretations of Arendt paradoxically end up strengthening conservative notions of masculinity. And I think I'm just going to stop there because at least another person sees this. I'm going to cry. Thank you. Thank you, lady. Thank you, Julianne. Thank you so much. And we're going to end there. So please follow along in my continued defense of Hannah Arendt.